This is episode 378 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Neil Redfern, Executive Director of the Council for British Archaeology. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When we think of Shakespeare collaborating with another writer, the name John Fletcher quickly comes to mind. Together, they penned Two Noble Kinsmen, All is True, which is also known as Henry VIII, and now lost play Cardenio. But what do we actually know about the working relationship between these two men? Did they sit down side by side at a table to write, or pass drafts back and forth through letters? Thanks to new research into the living arrangements of early modern Londoners, we have fresh insight into the possibility that Fletcher and Shakespeare were not just professional collaborators, but next-door neighbors. This week, we're exploring archival evidence that places them both on Bishopsgate Street in the late 16th century. Our guest, Domenico Lovascio, whose article, Giles, John, and Will, The Fletchers and Shakespeare in Bishopsgate Street, London, 1596, offers a compelling look at the real-life proximity of these famous playwrights. Domenico Lovascio is Associate Professor of English Literature at the University of Genoa, Italy. He is a leading scholar on early modern drama, particularly the works of John Fletcher and his collaborations with William Shakespeare. Domenico has published extensively on Renaissance playwrights and archival discoveries, and his work includes critical editions and historical research that recontextualize key figures of the early modern stage. His article on Shakespeare and Fletcher in Bishopsgate shines new light on the practical realities behind their creative partnership. Find more about Domenico and his work on John Fletcher in the show notes for today's episode. Before we get into today's conversation, I want to remind you that we've pulled together bonus materials for you over on Patreon. If you'd like to see what Bishopsgate Street looked like in Shakespeare's day, explore maps, period illustrations, and documents related to the neighborhood Shakespeare and Fletcher may have shared, you'll find all of that in this week's detailed show notes. You can access these extras while you listen today at CassidyCash.com/episode 378. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/EP 378. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Domenico. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life. It's so nice to have you here today.
Hello, Cassidy. It's good to be here.
What first drew your attention to the possibility of John Fletcher and William Shakespeare meeting in Bishopsgate, London in 1596? Can you tell us about the historical evidence that suggests this?
Yes, so the story of how I stumbled upon this possibility is actually quite serendipitous, you might say. I was participating in a seminar on the lives of Shakespeare's contemporaries and communities, led by Lisa Hopkins and Geoffrey Marsh. And during the seminar, we shared our research papers, and I mentioned my plans to write a biography of John Fletcher. Geoffrey, who had recently published work on Shakespeare, he mentioned some fascinating churchwarden's accounts that he'd encountered at the London Metropolitan Archive. These accounts, which recorded the collection of the parish clerk's wages for the parish of St. Ethelburga in the 1590s, provided some crucial details about the people living there. St. Ethelburga was one of 6 parishes that made up the ward of Bishopsgate around Bishopsgate Street. The parish itself was quite small. It mainly consisted of houses along Bishopsgate Street, along with 4 inn-yards: the Bull, the Green Dragon, the 3 Swans, and the Vine, and a few narrow side alleys on the west side. Geoffrey pointed out that the list of inhabitants included a Dr. Fletcher, who was recorded as living on the west side of Bishopsgate Street, seemingly from Michaelmas 1595 to Christmas 1596. Geoffrey wondered whether this might be Giles Fletcher, but he couldn't be sure. I was able to confirm that this Dr. Fletcher in the churchwarden's account was indeed Giles Fletcher, because I was familiar with another document in the National Archives in London that records Giles Fletcher as living in the parish of St. Ethelburga in 1596. Who was Giles Fletcher? Giles Fletcher was a doctor of civil laws, the remembrancer of the City of London, an ambassador to Russia, and importantly, he was the uncle of playwright John Fletcher. And this new document added important information because it allowed me to pinpoint the location of Giles' house in South Ethelburga with a good degree of accuracy. This is because the charge warden's accounts were recorded in house-by-house order, as the collector started at the southern end of the west side and walked north up the street, crossed the street, and then came back down along the east side. This means we can actually map out the geographical distribution of St. Ethelburga's residents along Bishopsgate Street. What's more, St. Ethelburga was not affected by the Great Fire of London in 1666. So the famous Ogilvy and Morgan's map of 1677 shows the building plots pretty much as they were in the 1590s. The map shows 10 properties between the Three Swans and the Vine Inns. According to the list, Giles Fletcher lived in the second house north of the Three Swans, so we can locate it with some confidence. And here is where things get really interesting. We know that Shakespeare was living in the parish of St. Helens in 1596, which is literally on the opposite side of Bishopsgate Street. We know that Shakespeare lived there because his name appears on two tax documents from 1597 and 1598. These documents show he was assessed for a national tax, but he failed to pay. Since he was listed as a defaulter in 1597, it is likely he had been living there for at least a couple of years prior, which places him in St. Helens in 1596. So Giles Fletcher and Shakespeare were neighbors, living less than a 5-minute walk from each other for about a year. Given how social relations worked back then, it's hard to imagine that they didn't know each other at all. At the very least, they would have bumped into each other while walking down Bishopsgate Street. Plus, the wealthier parish of St. Helens didn't have any inns, which would have made the 4 inns in South Ethelburga a major draw for the people living in St. Helens. Shakespeare would have crossed the street more than once to spend time at one of those inns, which were so close to Giles Fletcher's house. So the odds are definitely in favor of them having known each other, though, of course, there's no way of determining how well they knew each other.
Well, what was Shakespeare and Fletcher? What were they each doing in 1596? And share how those, I guess not occupations, because you mentioned that John Fletcher would have been quite young, but what they were doing, how would those things influence the likelihood of them knowing each other?
Yes. So in 1596, Shakespeare was 32, and he was already something of a celebrity in London. He'd had a string of successes on stage. His most recent plays included Richard II, Romeo and Juliet, and A Midsummer Night's Dream. And his narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, had also made quite a splash. So by this point, Shakespeare was well established, both as a playwright and as a published poet. But 1596 was a particularly eventful year for him. In July, his company's first patron died and was replaced as Lord Chamberlain by Lord Cobham. Then, in August, Shakespeare suffered a personal tragedy. His 11-year-old son, Hamnet, was buried. Around this time, Shakespeare was also wealthy enough to pay the substantial fee, which was somewhere between £5 and £10, to reactivate his father John's long-standing application for a coat of arms. And in November, he found himself caught up in a feud between the owner of the Swan Theatre and the Justice of the Peace. All the while, he was already hard at work on his next play, The Merchant of Venice. John Fletcher hadn't even turned 17 yet. Up until the middle of 1596, he was living in Chelsea with his father, Richard Fletcher, who was the Bishop of London, his stepmother Mary, and his siblings. Richard and Giles Fletcher, John's uncle, lived about 5 miles apart at the time, so John's visits to his uncle's house in St. Ethelburga wouldn't have been frequent, but they certainly were not out of the question. It's quite possible that Fletcher might have caught a glimpse of Shakespeare during one of those visits. But things changed dramatically for Fletcher in the second half of 1596. On the 15th of June, his father died suddenly. At the time, Richard Fletcher was deeply in debt, and it fell to Giles to sort out his brother's affairs and look after his children. Giles even petitioned Queen Elizabeth herself, hoping for some compassion for his brother's orphans, but his request didn't get anywhere until Giles managed to secure the support of the second Earl of Essex. For a long time, it's been assumed that John Fletcher stayed with his uncle Giles for several years and that they were quite close. But the truth is, we don't know. The Fletcher family relationships became strained around 1599-1600 when Giles ended up in a lawsuit with Richard's eldest son, Nathaniel, John's elder brother, and also took legal action against his brother-in-law, Nathaniel Pownall. So because of all this family tension, we can't say for certain how long John Fletcher stayed with Giles. Maybe until 1600. But in any case, it's very likely that for at least a few months after his father's sudden death, John and his siblings were living at their uncle's house in St. Ethelburga. And if John Fletcher was indeed staying there through Christmas 1596, he would have had several opportunities to run into his neighbor William Shakespeare.
Did Bishopsgate have any particular reputation for theater or publishing that might have been the reason that Shakespeare wanted to be in this area, or that even Giles Fletcher wanted to be there? I mean, I assume being so young, John Fletcher was obviously otherwise occupied and only living there because of his family. But what about Shakespeare? What might have attracted him to this area of London?
Bishopsgate wasn't really known as a center for theatre or publishing, but it gave Shakespeare some unique advantages that made it a great place for him to live and work. The parish of St. Helens, for example, was a lively and diverse community. You had merchants, artists, and even members of the gentry all living side by side, which created a really stimulating environment for anyone with a creative mind. However, one of the main reasons Shakespeare was probably drawn to Bishopsgate was its location. It was close to the main playhouses of the time, the Theatre and the Curtain, both just outside the city walls in Shoreditch, to the north and slightly east of Bishopsgate. For Shakespeare, who wasn't just writing plays, but also acting in them and handling business for the Lord Chamberlain's men, being able to walk to work was a huge practical advantage, especially when you consider how bad the roads could get and how rough the weather was. That convenience really mattered. Now, even though the heart of the publishing world was over by St. Paul's Cathedral, it wasn't too far southwest from Bishopsgate. Shakespeare could still get to the booksellers and find whatever research materials he needed. But maybe even more important, Bishopsgate gave him a balance between his public life and the privacy he needed to write. It let him step away from the constant interruptions and focus on his work when he needed to. As for why Giles Fletcher wanted to be there, it's more difficult to determine, but what we know is that in the 1590s, Giles Fletcher is recorded as moving frequently through different areas. So it is hard to determine why he wanted to live there.
Well, how does this historical moment, I mean, we're talking about potentially the first time that John Fletcher and Shakespeare would have come into physical proximity of one another. How does the understanding that possibility inform our understanding of their later collaborations? Because we know they did end up working together on Henry VIII and the Two Noble Kinsmen.
I'm not really sure that this moment directly changes how we read the plays they wrote together, but it does open an intriguing, I'd say, new possibility for how Fletcher and Shakespeare might have first crossed paths. Up until now, most people have just assumed that they must have met sometime in London between 1606, when Fletcher helped Francis Beaumont write The Woman Hater, and 1612, when Shakespeare and Fletcher co-wrote The Lost Cardenio. Of course, it's entirely possible that they met casually in the second half of the first decade of the 17th century, maybe at one of the many theatres around London. Or perhaps Shakespeare sought out Beaumont and Fletcher after the huge success of Philaster in 1609, or even reached out to Fletcher alone in 1610 to congratulate him on The Woman's Prize, which was a sort of sequel to The Taming of the Shrew. It's even possible that Fletcher himself ambitiously made a first move and reached out to Shakespeare. All these scenarios are plausible. And there are also a few different theories about how the collaboration came about, because some people think that Shakespeare himself recognized Fletcher's talent, his knack for collaboration, his pioneering of tragicomic romance, and his ability to keep up with the latest literary trends. And so Shakespeare saw him as a worthy successor. Others instead argue that it was Shakespeare's company, the King's Men, who brought Fletcher in, hoping to inject some new energy and friendly competition as Shakespeare's own output slowed and his plays became more introspective. There's even the possibility that the King's Men wanted to keep Beaumont and Fletcher as a team when Shakespeare started talking about retirement. But Beaumont was busy writing A Court Masque, which left Fletcher free to work with Shakespeare. Later, in 1613, Beaumont suffered a stroke and then died at 32, so the company never quite got the dream team, we might say, they hoped for, but by then Fletcher was already fully integrated into the King's Men and their ways. What I'm suggesting is that if Fletcher and Shakespeare did meet back in 1596, that early encounter could have had a much bigger impact than one may realize. One needs to imagine Fletcher at that moment, newly fatherless and probably feeling lost and uncertain about the future. His father had left nothing but debts, and his uncle, who had a dozen children of his own to care for, wasn't exactly in a position to guarantee a comfortable future for all his nieces and nephews. So what kind of future did John have to look forward to? And then there's Shakespeare, a living example of what was possible. Here was a man who came to London from Warwickshire and, through his writing and his business sense, had achieved financial security and social respectability. Shakespeare was, in every sense, a model of upward mobility. And for Fletcher, who was a gentleman by birth, but suddenly facing a very uncertain future, Shakespeare must have seemed like a beacon of hope. If they did meet in 1596, it would be another decade, roughly, before Fletcher wrote his first play for the stage. But maybe that early encounter stayed with him, especially as Shakespeare's fame continued to grow. Fletcher's own deep engagement with Shakespeare's work, which is something you can see clearly throughout his career, suggests he was watching and learning all along. The years between 1596 and 1606 are often called Fletcher's lost years because we know so little about what he was doing, but maybe during that time, Shakespeare served as an inspiration, sparking Fletcher's ambition to become a dramatist himself and reclaim his place in society through the theatre. Perhaps those lost years were occupied by his desire to become like Shakespeare, or even more, to become the new Shakespeare. In a way, Fletcher did become the new Shakespeare, taking over as the leading playwright for the King's Men after Shakespeare's death in 1616. So I think it's entirely possible that Shakespeare's encounter with Giles Fletcher's young nephew in 1596 played a part in their later collaboration. Maybe Shakespeare remembered that young man he'd met 16 years earlier at a time when both were in mourning, Fletcher for his father and Shakespeare for his son. And that memory influenced his decision to work with Fletcher and even to see him as a successor.
You've mentioned that there's a lot of questions about what we know for sure when it comes to the relationship between John Fletcher and William Shakespeare. But do we have any surviving letters or correspondence between these two men? Or is there any physical evidence beyond just analyzing the text of the plays to show that they worked together?
Well, no. Unfortunately, there's no surviving correspondence between Shakespeare and Fletcher, and not much direct evidence that they worked together. What we do have is the title page from the first quarter of the Two Noble Kinsmen, published in 1634. That page credits the play to, as it puts it, the memorable worthies of their time, Master John Fletcher and Master William Shakespeare, with Fletcher's name coming before Shakespeare's. And there's also a 1653 entry in the stationer's register for a play called The History of Cardenio, which was listed by the publisher Humphrey Moseley among works he hoped to bring out, but he never published Cardenio. When it comes to Henry VIII, however, things are different. Their collaboration in that play isn't backed up by any external documents. Instead, it's supported by what we call internal evidence. Basically, we're talking about clues in the writing style and structure of the play itself. And while Fletcher's own plays are packed with echoes, allusions, and reworkings of Shakespeare's scenes and characters, the actual historical record of their partnership is surprisingly thin. So even though we can see the influence they had on each other, the hard evidence of their working relationship is unfortunately very limited.
Well, as you've mentioned, there is a great deal of history to unpack here about Shakespeare's time in Bishopsgate, as well as understanding the life of John Fletcher. Domenico, what are some of your favorite resources you can recommend for us if we're new to this part of history and new to the relationship between Shakespeare and Fletcher? Where should we begin to learn more?
If anyone's interested in learning more about Shakespeare and Fletcher working together, I would really recommend checking out Chapter 5 of Shakespeare and Collaborative Writing by Will Sharp. The book is fantastic. It is an up-to-date look at Shakespeare's collaborations. If I can put in a quick plug for my own work, I've just published an article in Shakespeare Quarterly that explores Shakespeare's first folio of 1623 from Fletcher's point of view. I look at Fletcher as one of the folio's earliest readers and think about his noticeable absence from the volume, both in terms of his hidden role in Henry VIII and the fact that there aren't any prefatory verses by Fletcher. As for Fletcher himself, you really need to read Gordon MacMullen's landmark 1994 study, The Politics of Unease in the Plays of John Fletcher. It's a must-read and a classic in Fletcher studies. And of course, anything written by Lucy Monroe and Claire McManus on Fletcher is always insightful and a real pleasure to read.
We will place links to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode, so make sure you stay tuned for the URL for where to find those so that you can click and go directly to these resources. Now, Domenico, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, there are too many, and it's difficult to choose, of course, but I mean, given that what we're talking about in this episode, I would have to pick the second folio of the Fletcher plays, which was published in 1679. Its official title is 50 Comedies and Tragedies written by Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher, Gentlemen. But it's not just Fletcher's famous work with Beaumont. It also includes his solo plays and most of the ones he wrote with other collaborators like Philip Messenger, Nathan Field, and more. I'd go for the second folio over the first from 1647 because it has more plays and includes almost every play Fletcher was involved in. So if I was stranded on a desert island, I would have as much Fletcher as you could possibly fit into one single book.
I think that's an appropriate choice. Absolutely. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
At the moment, I'm co-editing Shakespeare's Julius Caesar for Cambridge Shakespeare Editions with an Italian colleague. At the same time, I'm working on a biography of John Fletcher. I'm actually in the process of revising my book proposal for a well-known publisher, which I will not name. I don't know if they will publish the book eventually, but I'm crossing my fingers and I let you know. I expect I'll be working on these two projects side by side for the next years because they're both pretty big undertakings and they will need a lot of work to get them to the standard that I'm hoping for.
Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed for you on these projects, and they do sound exciting. Thank you so much, Domenico, for being here this week to share this exciting history with us and take us on a fun look at how Shakespeare may have first bumped into John Fletcher. This was fun. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Cassidy. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
That's it for this week's episode on Shakespeare's neighborly connections with John Fletcher. A special thank you to Domenico Lovascio for joining us to share his remarkable archival evidence and helping us bring Shakespeare's world into clearer focus. If you'd like to explore the article we discussed today or see visual materials mentioned in our episode, you'll find all of these extras inside the detailed show notes at cassidycash.com/episode 378. While you're there, be sure to explore our Experience Shakespeare tier on Patreon, where you can access hands-on activity kits that invite you to dive into the history with a game, recipe, or craft straight from the life of William Shakespeare. Just click Access the detailed show notes from our regular show notes page and select Experience Shakespeare to get started. You can find all of these extras at cassidycash.com/episode 378. That's cassidycash.com/EP378. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. Until next time, may your neighbors be kind, your writing swift, and your collaborations fruitful. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.